Arizona is a problem like I've never seen before. You have supposed Republicans in charge who have won these offices, but you have Stephen Richer. Thank goodness he lost his reelection primary in July, but he's still running the Maricopa County elections through November. And he was one of the founders of an anti-Trump PAC. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
And, but the problem in Arizona is that they've just been so sloppy. And so you had more ballots came back in Maricopa County by mail that did not meet the criteria for a valid ballot, well more than the roughly 10,000 votes margin between President Trump and Joe Biden. So hopefully we've made enough noise, have enough people who documented the problems from 22 that now we know what to look for and what's happened. And that's the thing I would say about each of these states. We now have citizens who are armed and knowledgeable. And hopefully, people need to be involved in the election process. You need to work the polls. You need to be out there you need to sign up and be an election worker, be an observer. But if you're a lawyer, volunteer to be in the war rooms. But the more eyes and ears we have, the better.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week it is just me. We had on a fantastic guest, someone who's been with American Moment since the beginning and actually helped us get started. But before I get to that, as always, be sure to go to AmericanMoments.org. There you can find everything we have cooking as an organization. We have an open application for the spring for the Fellowship for American Statecraft, where we pay people $3,000 a month for 3 months to get their first job here in Washington. If you want to be in the mix, there is no substitute for moving here and doing the thing. So this program has been created to help people do that. We highly encourage you to apply. We also have the fall session of AM Fridays. This is our lunch seminar series on Capitol Hill for interns and junior staff to hear the 101 of how to think about the world that we do in the way that we do, a world that would put America first. And you can come and enjoy some free Chick-fil-A every Friday afternoon in one of the Senate offices there. Be sure to sign up for that on our website. And you can also find the backlog of this podcast, and you can become a member on YouTube by becoming either a truther or a statesman to get these episodes 24 hours early, as well as get special members only segments. And this week we had a fantastic members only segment. We had a fantastic episode with Cleta Mitchell, who is the senior legal fellow at CPI, the Conservative Partnership Institute, and the founder of the Election Integrity Network. Cleta is an attorney licensed in Oklahoma and the District of Columbia who has practiced election, campaign finance, and political law for decades. Cleta graduated from the University of Oklahoma and the University of Oklahoma College of Law. She is one of the founders and is chairman of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, the only conservative public interest law firm devoted solely to election integrity. She was one of the key attorneys who fought back against the Obama IRS during the targeting of Tea Party groups. She was a volunteer attorney for the 2020 Trump legal team in Georgia, and she's admitted to practice before many federal district courts and the United States Supreme Court. Cleta is godmother to most of the organizations in Washington that matter. She helped us get started a few years ago, and she's, I think, a stunning role model for what conservative lawyers should hope to become. Someone who's done it all: private practice, nonprofit, political, election work, and has really found a way to provide value to this movement while, earning a great living along the way. She's extraordinarily courageous, and she came and told us her story here on the episode today. The story of how she became who she is, the process by which she took on the Obama IRS, why she got fired from a big law firm because of a phone call involving President Trump and Brad Raffensperger. And we did a deep dive into what you should think about this upcoming election integrity in Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and more. It's one of the most fun episodes we've ever taped. I highly encourage you guys listen all the way to the end. We'll go now to Cleta Mitchell. Cleta, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
It's a long time coming. You played a critical role in American Moment's origin story. You helped us get incorporated, get our IRS certification, kept us out of jail for now. But we always love to talk about the guest's background and how they got to where they are today. Tell us the story. You know, how did you end up being in the position you are today in the conservative movement, doing the work that you do? You know, you're a lawyer. Did you think this was the kind of lawyer you were going to be? Tell us that story.
Well, I grew up in Oklahoma. I was a Democrat in Oklahoma. Went to the University of Oklahoma College of Law. So I'm a Sooner born, Sooner bred. When I die, I'll be Sooner dead. Sooner, Oklahoma Sooner.
And UT, so
so we won't talk about that.
Over.
Shortened immediately. Yeah. I can tell you that I started getting involved in political activities when I was very young. I used to tell my mom, don't go vote till I get home from school. And I would study even in elementary school, I would study the voter guides and tell my mom which judges to vote for and all, because, you know, she was probably not going to vote in those races. But my mom was always very much, voting was a responsibility, a right, and a privilege, and she never missed the opportunity to vote. That is literally one of my earliest memories of my mother is coming home from the polling place at like 7 in the morning. She'd gone to vote before she went to work. So I decided to go to law school primarily because I noticed when I was an undergraduate doing some different political things that there would be a lawyer in the room who would start saying the most ridiculously stupid things, but everybody would defer to him. And it was a him in those days. I was one of only, we had 150 people in my law class in the fall of 1973. And I want to say there were 20 of us who were 20 women. It was the most the University of Oklahoma had ever had in a freshman law class, the most women. Now women comprise a majority of the law students. But I can remember thinking that I wanted to be able to say, because when this person who would say something stupid would say, well, I'm a lawyer, and everybody would sort of go, oh, I wanted to be able to say, well, so am I. Now, what were we talking about? And to just sort of, and that literally is when I decided to go to law school. And so after law school, I ran for the legislature. I graduated in December 75. I was admitted to the bar, took the bar, and admitted in the spring of 76. And I ran for the legislature and won, defeated an incumbent, and served 8 years in the state legislature. And
as a Democrat?
As a Democrat. Mm-hmm. Wow. I was chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And but I used to beat up on the agencies because...
And you had to have been one of the youngest members there, too,
I was one of the youngest members. And I think at the time was told I was the first female in the country to chair a state legislative appropriations and budget committee. And I was able to do a lot of interesting things as a legislator, and I loved that. But honestly, I think back now and I think, oh, I'd be such a different legislator if I were there now. I would have different views and all.
You'd be a chair of a Freedom Caucus, probably.
Well, that's a whole interesting subject because I know quite a lot about legislatures and legislative bodies and all. And I was prepared to be on the backbench. And there's a certain freedom that comes, you know, it's like Chris Christopherson says, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Yeah. And there is freedom in that, but then you have to decide, do I want to be part of leadership? Because then there comes certain responsibilities. And Liz Cheney never understood that. She thought that she could vote against her entire caucus, her entire Republican conference, and still be one of the 3 officers. No, it doesn't work that way. Resign.
All the rights and none of the responsibilities.
Right, exactly. But anyway, but I was a fellow at the Institute of Politics one fall, and I met... there were 6 of us. They were fellows at the Institute of Politics. I was the Democrat, and Eddie Mai.
Sorry, this was the IOP at Harvard?
Harvard.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
And he was the Republican, and everybody thought we would fight with each other. But he and I became fast friends, and we beat up on the journalist. There was a reporter from the LA Times.
What was his background?
Well, Eddie he had been the executive director. He was a political consultant, a long time. He's since passed away. Wonderful person. He was a Republican political consultant, and he had been the executive director or chief of staff of the Republican National Committee during Watergate.
Wow.
So he literally rebuilt the Republican National Committee. And Eddie, he was brilliant, and he was a great conservative. And so he and I became really good friends. And he subsequently, we kept in touch. And he called me one day and asked me what I thought about, I was practicing law in Oklahoma City, and he asked me what I thought about congressional term limits. And I thought about our delegation in Washington at this point, it would have been the mid 80s, because I was a fellow in the fall of 81 with Eddie. So this would have been toward the end, 1988, 89, something like that. And I said, and I thought about every member of our delegation, our congressional delegation from Oklahoma, had been elected and had moved away in 1980 or before. Well, if you lived in Oklahoma in 1980, it was a boom town, boom state, because oil profits were up, oil prices were up, and Oklahoma's an oil producing state, and depends for its revenues on how well the oil and gas industry is doing. And when the bottom fell out of the oil market in, I want to say 81, 82, 83, well, now all of a sudden revenues go down. Things are not great. In Oklahoma City, where I lived and was practicing law, we literally had no new office buildings other than a new jail and a new IRS building. So it was government buildings, not private development, et cetera. And when Eddie asked me that, I said, well, that's interesting, because I do think, and I thought about our delegation, I thought they have no idea what it's like to live in Oklahoma today. And so I became involved with the national term limits effort and ended up moving to Washington in the fall of 1991 with my family. And I opened and ran a small nonprofit legal foundation on term limits for members of Congress. And I represented, as a lawyer, the term limits efforts in all these different states, and argued the case before the Arkansas Supreme Court and the Florida Supreme Court. Got former U.S. Attorney General Griffin Bell, who was a wonderful, great conservative constitutionalist, and he argued the case before the district court in the state of Washington, federal court. And it was Tom Foley versus term limits. I thought that was so great. But in any way, ended up being co-counsel with the case that went to the Supreme Court. And
these would have been for state level term limits.
It was term limits on members of Congress.
Oh, okay. So these were laws passed in each state for
Correct.
Their own delegations, right?
But that's right. And they were done by the initiative process. Mm-hmm. And there were 23 states that had adopted constitutional amendments or statutes. In the case of California, you have to have many more signatures for constitutional amendment. And tens of millions of Americans voted in favor of imposing term limits on their members of Congress.
Every time this would go to the polls in a state, what were the typical margins that you guys would win by?
Well, originally the first one we lost in Washington State. Because why? Because the Democrats changed the subject. Like so many issues, I could tell you, we go down the list, so many issues. 80%, 85% of the American people, Republican, Democrat, Independent, support term limits for members of Congress. But I used to say to people, but you know who that 15% is who oppose it?
The politicians.
Yes. It's that 1% that Scott Rasmussen talks about, that the elitists, they control the media. They're the elected officials, Hollywood, big companies. I also used to say that any company big enough to have a vice president of government relations was opposed to term limits because they built all these cozy relationships. They didn't want to start over. Yeah. And so that the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, against us ruled that to impose term limits on members of Congress is a qualification, and that could only be done by constitutional amendment. And if you ever want to really understand the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, that all powers not specifically given to the Congress and the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people, well, that theory, that legal principle has been pretty much damaged over the years. But Clarence Thomas wrote a brilliant dissent in that case, and he based it on the 10th Amendment. It's just beautiful. If any law students or lawyers are listening, go look it up. Go read it's U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, and read Justice Thomas's brilliant dissent in that case.
Who wrote that opinion?
Well, I believe that it was, that's a good question. I don't remember who wrote the majority opinion. I really don't. I don't remember because I was just focused on, Sandra Day O'Connor voted wrong. She was the swing vote, but it was 5-4. Anyway, so after that, I now was in Washington, and so I went in the private practice of law. I had a little bitty law firm, and we were doing campaign finance and election law. And I've always said in my election law practice, political law, that I always say to lawyers and law students, you don't know what your clients are going through. If your name has never been on the front page of the pleading, and your name just is always on the back page where you sign your name, you don't understand what it's like to have your name on the front page of those pleadings. And I always have said, most of the things that my clients did, I had done. I'd started and run a nonprofit. I had been a candidate and an elected official. I had done lobbying work. I'd done citizen lobbying. I was once a lobbyist for a short time for Major League Baseball, which was kind of interesting. But and those are all the things that you do. And elections. I mean, I had worked on elections, and I knew very granular detail everything about the election process. And so that was my law practice had been my law practice for many, many years. And I've been outside counsel to the Republican House Committee, the Senatorial Committee, many members of Congress, their campaigns, and lots of conservative groups. I used to say when I was in private practice that I was the consigliere to the vast right-wing conspiracy.
Still are, I think.
To some degree. Yeah. But that's what in 2001, I merged my little law firm, 2 people, into one of the largest law firms in the country, Foley and Lerner, headquartered in Milwaukee.
Same Foley that represented you at the Supreme Court?
No, different Foley. No,
okay.
Gosh, no. He was the Speaker of the House at the time, and he was against term limits. Yeah. But no, this is a firm that was started in the 1850s in Milwaukee, and so is one of the. At one time, it was the 11th largest law firm in the country. Wow. I don't really know where it stands now, but in any event, so I took my practice and practiced there for 20 years, and until January 31st of 2021.
I want to get to the story of how that happened the way it did, but the way that I remember first hearing about you is as a college student. About this lawyer that took on the IRS and won. Maybe that feels like ancient history at this point. I don't know. It feels like one of those formative things I learned about how the conservative movement works. Tell us that story. And is that accurate, that kind of really put you on the map in a big way, made you more of a household name, or is that inaccurate?
Well, I don't consider myself a household name right now, but I represented a lot of conservative organizations. And one of the things I did, as you mentioned at the outset, is I've helped many, many groups who come to me and say, we want to start a group. We have this. So I always say, you tell me what you want to do, and then I'll tell you what kind of entity you need to do it. Do you want to do lobbying? Do you want to just do educational work? Do you want to do political work? I mean, depending on what you want to do, there is an IRS category for you have to check a box when you get your IRS employer ID number. And so I represented many, many groups over the years, and I knew how long took to get a C3 form approved or a C4 approved. And so beginning in about 2009, I started realizing that I hadn't heard back. We'd submit these papers to the IRS and something that would take 30 days. Now we're hearing nothing. And so I think I finally calculated I represented 11 groups that between the fall of 2009 and through the time that the IRS basically they stopped processing applications for exempt status from groups that had names like Tea Party or Patriots or there were groups that called themselves 9/12 groups that were sort of rebirthed after 9/11, different things like that, or groups that had as, part of their mission was to hold government accountable. And if those were considered, be on the lookout. They had what they called a BOLO list, be on the lookout for these names, these phrases. And I'll tell you the interesting story that I learned later was that, so what happened is something that would take 30 days or 6 months, it was taking years, if at all. I had this one client that was formed to fight Obamacare. And one of the requests, we kept getting these requests from the IRS, and one of the requests came in that they wanted copies of all of the TV ads that had been run against Obamacare. Well, now, why does the government want that? Why is the IRS entitled to that? This is a 501c4. They're entitled to do that. It's lobbying. Doesn't mention a candidate. Doesn't mention a political party. It's not political. They can spend 100% of their money doing that. So I wrote them a letter and said, because we had to deliver it. You want to say no, but they say, well, if you don't give us this, we'll close your file. So I sent it to them, and then nothing. So 3 months later, I sent them a letter, and I said, I have to think the reason you haven't processed this application, which has now at this point been pending for 2 years, is because you disagree philosophically, and this is a political decision being made by bureaucrats who don't want my client to receive the exempt status to which they're entitled. And I get this phone call. Oh, no. We're not doing that. We just need more information. And they were all peaches and cream, but we still didn't have our letter of exempt status. And so the way that the whole thing was brought to light is that Jim Jordan, who at the time was just a member of the oversight committee, and he's getting all these constituents who are telling him, we can't get our IRS applications approved. We've been waiting 2 years, 3 years. And so he says to his staff, find out who's in charge of this and get them over here. Meet with them, find out what's going on. So they got Lois Lerner over, the staff, and met with her.
She was the head of the IRS under
She was the head of the IRS exempt organizations unit. Now, I had known her and who she was because she'd been at the Federal Election Commission. And we all thought that when she moved from the FEC to the IRS, ding dong, the witch is dead. We knew that she hated conservatives, and she was always on a jihad against conservatives and Republicans. So we were really glad. What harm can she do at the IRS? We were just glad to have her out of her hair at the FEC. Fast forward a few years. So now she comes over, she meets with the staff, Congressman Jordan's staff, and she's so arrogant and so dismissive. We can do whatever we want. We can take as long as we want. There's no time limit. And she leaves, and they're all sitting there. They're telling me this a couple of years later, that they say, well, we can't go back to Jordan. We cannot tell Congressman Jordan that it was a useless meeting and she was so arrogant. So we have to go back to him with a recommendation for what to do. So they came up with, asked for an inspector general's investigation. So that's what they did. And he got Darrell Issa, who at the time was chairman of the Oversight Committee, and Jim Jordan sent a letter to it's called the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, TIGTA, asked for an investigation. And lo and behold, the TIGTA report comes out, and it says that they've discovered this BOLO list. They've discovered here are all these hundreds of groups from all over the country who have not had their applications processed. They've been sitting there for years and years, and they issue this report. And for about a weekend, the national media was horrified. And I tried to get the Republican leaders at the time to understand they're only going to be horrified for about 15 minutes. And when they realize, oh, it's conservatives who are being targeted, they're going to switch, and they're going to say that's fine with them. And now we wouldn't even get 15 minutes of being horrified. But after that was, before the report was released, Lois Lerner had been told it was going to be released that day, and so she was giving a speech to the tax-exempt attorneys at the annual their annual meeting. It's a division of the American Bar Association, and so she. Do
you go to those meetings? What's that like?
No, I'm not a member of the ABA. Yeah. I always sent my money to the Federal Society instead of the ABA, but and she acknowledged that perhaps there had been a delay. So. Like I say, and so then there were congressional hearings, and I filed a suit on behalf of True the Vote, which had been trying to get its exempt status. I first talked to them, I want to say, in the spring at CPAC in February of 2011. And I said, well, why don't you they had submitted the application themselves. Mm-hmm. And
what did this organization want to do?
True the Vote? Mm-hmm. They were involved in election integrity. Mm-hmm. They wanted to look at voter rolls and try to make sure that they were started in Harris County, Texas, in Houston. And they finally we did sue them, and before the IRS answered, they issued the letter of exempt status and moved to say the case was now moot. Anyway, the case went up on appeal and back. But the point was that they used the power of the government, the IRS, and the functionaries. And here's the other thing. These are not political appointees. There is one political appointee in the IRS besides the commissioner, and the commissioner has a set term. But there is one Schedule C appointee, and that's the general counsel of the IRS. Everybody else in the IRS is a civil service employee. So it just shows you that within the administrative state, when President Trump talks about the deep state, it's not very deep. It's pretty much out there. And that it goes pretty deep.
Yeah. And that's really striking because FEC commissioner, which was her previous title, Lois Lerner, is a political appointment.
Well, no, she wasn't a commissioner.
No, she wasn't a commissioner.
She was the head. She was the head of one of the enforcement divisions or something. But believe me, the staffers
was that a
control
political
things.
Appointment?
No,
okay, so she's just kind of been floating around in the deep state for a long time.
Right, yeah. Exactly. And so that was. But after it sort of all broke, it was something that some of us had been dealing with for a number of years, and I had been attending these meetings of a group of lawyers who would meet once a month, Democrats and Republicans, but people who practice political law. And I said, is anybody else having these problems? Are you Democrats having problems getting your applications processed? No. I said, well, we are. Our side, we're having problems.
Well, and why does it matter? I mean, just to say this out loud, like I've dealt with donors for a long time. Wealthy people, they want to make sure that they're buttoned up when they're giving donations, that what's tax exempt is actually tax exempt and stuff. I mean, it creates a chilling effect on these organizations' ability to be effective, aggressive from day one and to do the work that they want to do. And so even if down the line they get their certification from the IRS, that's months, years of lost time during critical moments like the Obamacare fight, like any of the other public policy conversations going on during the Obama administration. So it's a real coup for the left when they're able to put a chilling effect on conservative activity in hot moments, which is what that 8-year span definitely was. And
just remember that this didn't all become known until 2013. It was after Obama's reelection.
Yeah.
So you have all these groups that might have organized to do something in the 2012 election, but they didn't. And the kinds of questions were so intrusive that it was pretty shocking.
This might be a sort of a strange question, but I think a lot about how a lot of the Tea Party energy that came about in the early days of the Obama administration, by the end of the Obama administration, a lot of that had gotten laundered into kind of a corporatized version of the movement that was more focused on, what big business wanted rather than what motivated the citizens that started that movement early on. Is part of the reason why is because, a small group in Ohio self-filing, trying to, to the best of their ability, do it versus a, big corporate lobby group. The big corporate lobby group probably knew how to make sure that their application got jammed through. Meanwhile, these small guys were left in limbo for a long time. I mean, it just seems like the consequences for how that movement was shaped over time.
Well, I don't think that the movement, I don't think the movement morphed into a corporate sort of structure. What happens with movements? I've been involved in a lot of movements. I'm kind of a movement girl.
Yeah.
Whether it was the women's movement and when I was in college and law school, the term limits movement, and now I would say the election integrity movement. And one of the things I know is that there's a sort of standard lifespan, and there's an initial rush of excitement or maybe anger that spawns the movement. You can't sustain that long term. You have to, and that's what I've tried to do with the election integrity movement, which is what I've been doing for the last 3.5 years, is just let's take what happened in 2020. We know there were problems with the election in 2020. Can we take that, get to the bottom of it, learn what happened, and we can't go back and fix it. We can't relitigate that. But maybe there are things we can do going forward and to try to shape that into citizen action going forward. And that's really been my focus for the last 3.5 years. And I think to some degree, and there are a couple of the Tea Party groups that have survived, and that's what they've done. The Tea Party Patriots, there are still Tea Party Patriots groups and leaders all over the country. And if you want to generate action, that's one of the groups you go to because they know how to mobilize and give people tools and keep them informed. And you have to have a way of doing that and trying to keep things going. It's not easy to do long term.
Yeah.
But what they did, the Obama administration used the levers of government to penalize their political opposition.
Weaponization.
They weaponized the IRS. They showed this crowd, this Biden-Harris crowd, they showed them how to do that.
Yeah. So you were doing all of this fantastic work while you were at a big firm. You had your area of practice, election law, nonprofit law, et cetera. Why aren't you still working at Foley & Lardner? What happened in January of 2021?
Well, I had, in the summer of 2020, I had actually approached Mark Meadows, who had been one of my clients when he was still in Congress, and he'd gone to the White House to become chief of staff. And I approached him and I said, what's the campaign doing to prepare for the post-election? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you remember what happened in Florida in 2000? Well, that's going to happen this fall in November, but it's not going to be one state. It's going to be 6 to 8 states. And he said, any
stock picks that I can
he said, and I started explaining what needed to happen, and it needed to be, you couldn't wait. I said, what you cannot do is you cannot wait until election night or the next morning and have hair on fire trying to figure out what to do. I said, that will not work. And so he said, well, you talk to the president. So he had the president call me. And I said the same thing to President Trump. I said, well, you got to prepare for the post-election. He said, well, I've got to win first. I said, yes, but you have to preserve your victory. And he said, okay, great. And he said, and I said I was prepared to I could manage to put that together and would do that. But I wasn't offering to do it for free. And so I said, but I have to be retained, and I'll put together a team and we'll start putting it together. This was in late August of 2020. And then I called Mark back and said, the president said, let's do it. And I didn't ever hear anything else. I ran the traps, talked to my management, did all the conflicts checks and everything, and waited. And I didn't ever hear anything back until the day after the election, because guess what they didn't do? They didn't prepare, and hair on fire for, election night and the day after and the day after.
What was that first call like the day after the election?
Well, Mark called me, and there was and said, where are you? I happened to be in Bozeman, Montana, because I represented the state party and I represented Senator Daines. And so I decided, you know what? I'll go help them. I want to make sure that everything was going right in Montana. We won everything. It was great. And I was literally in my car putting in the address to get back to the Bozeman airport to fly home. And Mark called me and said, where are you? I said, well, I'm in Bozeman, Montana. And he said, could you go to Atlanta? And there was a part of me that wanted to say, this is what I told you not to do. But I didn't, because I said yes, but somebody there has to know I'm coming. And so I went to Atlanta and started looking at the election and what a nightmare it had been, and starting to realize, what was going on, and ended up staying there. And we put together an election contest under Georgia law. Every state has a statutory provision, a process where you can file an election contest and challenge the results if you can show that there are more votes that were cast and counted in violation of state law than the margin between the candidates. And the remedy for such if you can prove that in court, the remedy is a new election. Well, guess what?
And that's all black and white in statutes.
It's in the statutes. It's in the statutes of every state. And so we filed this election contest, and we never had a judge appointed to hear the case. Now, that is one of the more shocking experiences I have ever had in my life. And people kept calling, and the president kept calling, saying, we got a judge yet? No, Mr. President.
Whose job is it to appoint a judge in that scenario?
The chief judge, when you sue under the Georgia Constitution, when you sue a constitutional officer, the case must be brought in Fulton County, which is Atlanta. However, the election code says that in any election contest, the chief judge of the county where it is brought must appoint a judge in another county to hear the case. So the chief judge in Fulton County was a judge named Chris Brasher. It was his job to appoint an eligible judge to hear the case, and he did not do that until January the 4th, 1 month after we filed the election contest. And it's required by law to be expedited. We sued for expedited emergency relief, and we never had a day in court. So whenever anybody says that President Trump lost all of his cases, well, he didn't lose ours, because he never got his day in court in Georgia. And as a result of that, so here we are on January the 2nd, and I get this call from Mark Meadows telling me that the president is going to have a phone call with the Secretary of State. And I just said, well, he can't do that. He's suing the Secretary of State. Anyway, the president's view was, look, what we had done is we had all of this data showing all of these irregularities, all these votes that had been cast and counted in violation of state law in a number of different categories. I think we had 18 categories, maybe more, maybe 30 categories. It's been a while of votes in different categories that had been cast and counted. And well over the margin. The margin was 11,779 votes, which was the third vote tally, by the way. There was the original tally, there was a recount, and then there was a second recount. None of those figures matched, which ought to tell you something. Mm-hmm. You ought to be able to match the numbers. And so the Secretary of State just kept saying, well, your numbers are wrong. And we kept saying, and we said this, we said all these back channel efforts, just sit down with us, go over the data. If we're wrong, we will tell everybody we're wrong. But if you're wrong, it's your job to do something, to fix it. And they would never do that. And that was the infamous phone call with the president. And, one of the things that Selena Zito said once about President Trump in 2016 was that for Trump supporters, they take him seriously, but not literally. For Trump detractors, they take him literally, but not seriously. And, when the president says things, a lot of times I've realized, well, I know what he meant. When he said, we just have to find 11,780 votes. Well, we'd already found them. They were in our lawsuit. Every name, their address, their county. We had found way more than 11,779.
And these were improperly cast votes or votes that had been improperly prevented from being counted?
No, they were all counted. There were 18,325 votes cast by people whose registration addresses were shown by the U.S. Postal Records as being vacant. Vacant lot, vacant house, vacant. Well, those votes shouldn't have been counted.
Yeah.
That's just one category. There were another 1,000, 2,000 whose addresses were at U.S. post offices or UPS stores. Well, Georgia law says it has to be your primary residence. I don't know anybody who lives in a post office. And so, it's just issue after issue after issue. And he kept saying, well, your data is wrong. And we kept saying, well, then show us your data. We've shown you ours. That if we can't have a trial, let's sit down and compare it. He wouldn't do that. That's what the president was asking. And so the media, of course, establishment media said Trump was trying to get him to go find votes. No, we'd found them. What the president was asking was for those votes, that data to be compared to make sure that there weren't 11,780 because then that would have required a new election. But as a result, the phone call was illegal and secretly recorded by Jordan Fuchs, who was the Deputy Secretary of State. She released it to the Washington Post.
Is Georgia single-party consent? How does that work?
Yes, Georgia is a two-party consent. Mm-hmm. However, it was recorded by Jordan Fuchs in Florida, Georgia's a one-party. Florida is a two-party consent state. Mm. So it was illegally recorded, which is why they had to give Jordan Fuchs immunity to testify before the Fannie Willis grand jury because of the fact that she had illegally recorded the call. So once that was published by the Washington Post, then the Lincoln Project, those bunch of perverts who run that thing they took after me because I was on the call and one of the other attorneys, both of the other attorneys. And so they just shut down our switchboard our law firm, all over, all the offices all over the country. But what they really did was that they went to the corporate clients of the firm. And so they started calling those corporations and saying, your corporation hired Foley and Lardner, and this person, Cleta Mitchell, is a partner at Foley, and you need to pressure them to fire her in order, or that you're going to take away their business. And so I start getting these calls and emails from all these partners, and they start, raising Cain. And so I negotiated.
It's been crazy for them because, how much of their business was about to go up in smoke, right?
Exactly. And you know what? I didn't have any interest in torpedoing the firm. Yeah. And, and I've been thinking about, June 1st of that year was 20 years. And I've been thinking that would be a good time to leave and do something else. And so we negotiated my departure. And so I left end of January of 2021.
It's a crazy story because it tells you, about how the corrupt media operates. It tells you about how the rules are differently applied to left and right. It tells you about the corporate capture by the left and so much more. But you have not been idle.
I have not been idle.
And if anything, it's like, strike me down and I'll return more powerful than ever before. You've been working on the election integrity issue for the last 3.5 years. And I think it'd be a valuable exercise to go state by state. Tell us where we were and where we are today and what that means about how 2024 is going to go. Let's start with your favorite state, Georgia.
Well, Georgia is at the epicenter. Yeah. For some reason, I don't really know why, but it is at the epicenter. And in 2020, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, who's a complete moron, and I have nothing good to say about him. He just loves the national media. He's like a St. Bernard, and they're just scratching behind the ears, and he just loves that. And
he's so principled. Principled.
But he did all kinds of terrible things before 2020. He broke the law, sending out hundreds of thousands of absentee ballot applications with no legal authority to do that. People have to request an absentee ballot in Georgia. And so they did all these things. The left went to him and got anything they could think of he would do. And so this time he's not able to do all those things he was able to do in 2020.
Is that because of legislative changes that Georgia
Legislative changes. The legislature has let it be known that they are not happy with him, and they have removed him as the chairman of the state election board, and basically now severed his relationship, his no role with the state election board.
Wow.
And so
even though he got reelected, he doesn't have
And you know what?
power.
He would not have been reelected had it not been for the fact that they have an open primary. And to all within the hearing of my voice, just understand, if you want conservatives in office, you cannot have open primaries. And guess who it is who's out pushing open primaries? That's on the ballot in South Dakota. These left-wing groups, funded by their Democrat left-wing billionaire donors, are trying to get open primaries. They want to have then jungle primaries like they do in California and Washington and places where they do these things so that our side can never win again. And so that's how he got re-nominated. He wouldn't have won if Georgia had a closed primary. But now we have a state election board that's under fierce attack in Georgia because they're adopting rule of law rules to implement the state statutes. And the one that they're most concerned about, the left, and they're going berserk about this, is that election boards are to make certain that the numbers match, that the number of voters matches the number of ballots issued, matches the number of votes. Those numbers are supposed to match under Georgia law. They don't want that. They say, oh, if we take all that time, it'll delay certification. Okay, their position is that they'd rather certify quickly, even if the numbers are wrong. I don't actually think that's where most Americans are, but at least now we know that. We know what the battle is in Georgia. And so I would say, there are a couple of court cases right now. We're fighting with the left over the state election board and its rules. But I would say, at least we know what's going on. We know that where the battle lines are drawn. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's true in Pennsylvania. one of the things, let me just stop. One of the things that I have done since 2020 is created the Election Integrity Network, which is all over the country. We have state coalitions. We have working groups on everything from election technology and what citizens need to know about having oversight over the voting systems that are used, how to protect vulnerable voters that the left preys upon, how to clean voter rolls, only citizens vote. We've been doing a lot this year on making a big issue out of the threat of non-citizen voting. So we have groups and citizens organized in all these states. Pennsylvania, we have a coalition in every county, and they're working on a restore confidence in Pennsylvania elections and going to every county commission and every election board and just making sure they understand here's what the law requires and to try to make them follow the law. The same is true in North Carolina and Wisconsin and Michigan and Nevada. We have a group in Nevada who've been working on cleaning the voter rolls in Clark County and other counties. And the reason that matters is because the Democrats, as soon as they took over the Nevada legislature in 2021, they changed the law to require that a ballot, not an application, but a ballot be sent to everyone on the voter rolls. So you have these tens of thousands of live ballots going to commercial addresses, to bars and Zeno parlors. And so trying to get those bad registrations off the rolls so they don't have those live ballots being sent. And so...
What about Arizona?
Arizona is a problem like I've never seen before. You have supposed Republicans in charge who have won these offices, but you have Stephen Richer. Thank goodness he lost his reelection primary in July, but he's still running the Maricopa County elections through November. And he was one of the founders of an anti-Trump PAC. Now that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
And, but, you know,
what were the problems with Arizona last time?
The problem in Arizona is that they started a process many years ago of trying to get everybody to vote by mail. So this huge percentage of the Arizona population votes by mail. And the processing takes forever. I represented former Congressman J.D. Hayworth in 2006. He lost his reelection, but it was after Thanksgiving before they finished counting the ballots in Maricopa County. And so now we are hoping that, and the biggest problem was that they didn't follow the law. They didn't follow chain of custody. They didn't make sure that they knew exactly how many ballots were in a tray before it was delivered to the ballot processing company. And so a lot of and they did the same things in 2022 on election day, which is when most Republicans tend to vote, is election day. I would remind everybody, VIP 1, vote in person, first day you can. I would never mail a ballot, but I also would never wait till election day to vote. Too many things can happen. And so they've just been so sloppy. And so you had more ballots came back in Maricopa County by mail that did not meet the criteria for a valid ballot, well more than the roughly 10,000 votes margin between President Trump and Joe Biden. So hopefully we've made enough noise, have enough people who documented the problems from 22 that now we know what to look for and what's happened. And that's the thing I would say about each of these states. We now have citizens who are armed and knowledgeable, and hopefully, you know, people need to be involved in the election process. You need to work the polls. You need to be out there you need to sign up and be an election worker, be an observer. But if you're a lawyer, volunteer to be in the war rooms. But the more eyes and ears we have, the better. So
I'm going to ask you to predict the future a little bit. I think you've given a really sober case for cautious optimism about how the situation is different today than it was in 2020. Well, what's the squeaky wheel? What's the thing that, man, it just hasn't quite been fixed yet? And if we do lose because of a razor-thin election and impropriety, that will have been the reason why.
Well, I would say two things. We have worked really hard to make sure that people all over this country have identified the problems in the voter rolls. Oh my gosh, the voter rolls are a mess. They're just a complete mess. And we have had, and there is a reason that Mark Elias and even a week ago, the Department of Justice sent out a memo to every election official in the state, every state saying, oh, you can't remove anybody from the voter rolls between now and November. Well, that's not actually true under the law. That is not accurate. They take the position you can't remove non-citizens. Well, guess what? That was never a valid registration in the first place. And so I would say that an area where we've made a lot of progress, but we need a number more years to resolve this. We need some congressional changes, is in voter rolls. And I would tell you,
and that's a traditional problem in election integrity, right? That's not a 2020 issue. No, that's been for 30 years.
But what is new since 2020 are the literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers all over this country who have started looking at the voter rolls in their communities. And now many of them have gotten a lot of bad registrations removed, but there's a lawsuit that was just filed in Georgia again, about 3 weeks ago, because the Fulton County, Atlanta, Director of Elections publicly stated that they don't remove any bad registrations from the rolls, that they just don't. Well, that's a violation of federal and state law. But so that's what we have now that we didn't have before, and we're going to continue, hopefully, through this election. But what happens is that it creates the opportunity for fraud. If you have fake people on the ballot, on the rolls, then can they use that name, and particularly if you're talking about mail, because that's unsupervised voting, and that's a way that that bad guys are able to commandeer somebody else's identity. It's really identity theft and vote theft. But I'll tell you, these lefties, they have more money than you can imagine. The Capital Research Center estimates that the left has spent between 11 and $14 billion. That's billion. That's B with a bill. B billion since about 2011, changing the way we vote. And so we're not going to undo that overnight.
Yeah.
But I'll give you an example. A week ago, I received a text message to my phone number addressed to Margaret, that is my daughter, who lived in Dallas until October of 2009, at which time she moved to Australia. And after moving to Australia, she then moved to London, has not lived in the United States since 2009. And I received a text message, Dear Margaret, we have sent a voter registration form to your address in Dallas, but we haven't received it back from you. May we contact you? Kamala Harris is the only person who can defeat President Trump. So I sent it to Kim Paxton and said, now, what is the list they're using? Has my daughter's address from 2009, sending it to my phone number. And so my question is, should I keep looking? Should I keep watching the Dallas, Texas voter rolls to see if perhaps they know she's no longer there? If they then fill that out, register her, vote in her name? So I haven't responded to them, but I did send it to Kim Paxton, but I am going to keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of things that they do. And to some degree, it's hard for our side to anticipate what they're going to do because we just don't think like that.
Yeah. They're really crafty. For our members only section, I'm going to ask Cleta about what she sees in the conservative legal movement, its shortcomings, the good, bad, and the ugly. But in order to see our members only segments, you have to go to YouTube and become a truther or a statesman. Those are our membership tiers. And you can hear these episodes 24 hours early, get invited to special events here in DC, and see these members only segments. So, if you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out. Cleta, where can people keep up with everything that you're doing?
Well, the only thing that I would tell you is I decided earlier this year, even before Elon Musk endorsed President Trump, that we probably should support him. And so you can find me at Twitter at Cleta Mitchell.
Wonderful. Thank you for everything you do for the movement. I think that when it comes to role models for what conservative lawyers should be, you are chief amongst them. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed taping it. I highly encourage you to tune into the special members only section. If you're not a member, you can do that by going to YouTube and joining as either a truther or a statesman. Those are our 2 tiers. And you can get these episodes 24 hours early that way. Be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on X, on Facebook, and on these other social media platforms. Rumble, if you enjoy that. I think we're at like 11,000 and change followers on Twitter. Let's bump those numbers up. Be sure to share the clips of this show that come out. That's the way that most people see it. We've got millions and millions and millions of views on these clips, not only because the Kamala Harris HQ account seems to have taken particular interest in one of our clips with JD. Thank you guys, as always, for listening. We are really enjoying this season of deep work, trying to prepare for opportunities here in Washington in the new year. We're grateful, as always, that you guys are along for the ride. If you would like to reach out to us, go to americanmoment.org/join. But until then, we'll see you next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.